Hello, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started with this session. I know that there's probably going to be people trickling in. Native time is always prevalent in these kinds of situations, so we'll let them catch up with us, but I'll just give a quick introduction. Coetzi Hopa, my name is Francis Vigil. I am from the Pueblo of Zia. I am also Jemez Pueblo and Hickory Apache. I work for the Bureau of Indian Education as the education specialist for Native language, history, and culture. And I've been with the BIE for about 4 years and been doing this work with the BIE for a number of years. And so I'm going to be talking today about some important pieces that we've been including and working on within the BIE, but also as a culturally and linguistically responsive education piece, really talking about how cultural competency frameworks are really a vital component when we start to look at culturally and linguistically responsive education. I'm going to talk about some foundational pieces that we have within our systems, and we all are aware of culturally and linguistically responsive education. We've heard those words before, but we're going to more specifically take a deeper dive into cultural competency frameworks and look at how those are important within our educational systems. And I just wanted to remind everybody, I know there's somebody on mute. Could you please mute your microphone? Thank you, appreciate that. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And so we're going to take a deeper dive into cultural competency frameworks now, why they're so important and a vital component when we first start to look at engaging culturally and linguistically responsive education. And so when we enter into new spaces, we would never enter into a space blindly. I would like you to think about some scenarios with me, and let's take a look at a vacation, first of all. When we go on a vacation, we would never hop in the car, head to the airport, and try and grab whatever flight is available. Even if it's sporadic, you have to show some considerations, such as how much money you have, how much time you have. However, like most people, trips like vacations are often planned out carefully. You consider where you're going to go. You often consider first the destination. What do you do? What do you need to do to get there? What are some things you must know about the place you are visiting? What are the places you would like to go and visit while you're there? What is the general climate like? What clothes do you need to take? What do you need to pack? Do they speak the same language that you do? What are some general understandings you must have when you go on a vacation? There are a lot of considerations you must take prior to committing and getting there. Think about going to visit a friend at their home for the holidays. Building relationship is the first part, but being invited gives a sense of pride and belonging. So once you are invited, you want to be respectful of your friends. You want to be respectful of their space, their home, their family, their values, their culture, their beliefs. And depending on your similarities, there may be some things that are commonalities, but everyone has a different way of engaging in their own homes. I have been to some homes where it's customary to take off your shoes upon entering a home. In Native communities and families, there may be cultural rules about trying food. In some cultures, completely rude to burp. In others, it's a sign that the food was awesome. In some households, there are vegans or dietary restrictions. Thus, it is not rude to ask ahead of time for some guidance prior to entering a new space, especially if it's not your space. You want to honor the guest and the invitation. Lastly, let's take that last scenario a bit further. In friendships, there is an initial meeting. As we have heard throughout our life, first impressions are critical. We all gravitate to people we feel comfortable with. However, we also need to see people for who they are. Because another old saying that we have all heard over the course of our lifetimes is don't judge a book by its cover. Building relationships is a delicate balance, and building friendships is an even tighter balance. In all of these scenarios, we do our best to learn, plan, and understand the spaces we are entering. However, as educators, we must also take careful, conscious, and mindful considerations prior to entering spaces in this case. Communities, families, and tribes. What are the essential understandings we must have before we even begin to educate? What are the crucial understandings that we must have in order to understand the places and spaces that we are entering? In this presentation, we will take a look at how critical it is to establish cultural competency within a given space. We will also look at how establishing cultural competency is not a one-way road. It requires a conscious and an intentional effort by all parties involved. So as we enter these spaces and you look at this slide, we want to make these considerations, and we do this on a regular basis. But as educators, what are some specific things that we need to do when we're entering a space that may not be our own? And so as we start to venture into this journey of education, what are some of those words from the field that we've heard? As an educator and as somebody who's visited numerous different communities, different schools, different tribes across the United States, and talked to a slew of educators in that time, I've heard a lot of different things talked about. And I always ask educators, what are some things that you need in order to be successful? Or what are some understandings that you need to have in order to be successful in this school, in this educational learning environment? What are those things? I've heard things from, hey, I want to implement animals, but I don't know what to do because some of those things may be taboo. I've had teachers that have told me they've talked about certain animals in certain tribal communities, and those have been shunned because they didn't understand that those animals, why they were taboo, why they were not okay to talk about in certain places, spaces, or even during certain times of the year. I've heard people say, I want to include culture and history into my lesson plans, but I don't know how and why. Well, that's when we start to look at what is the history of a specific place. The history book we use doesn't discuss the local tribe. The student is never in my class. I can't teach if they're not in my class. Why don't natives, why doesn't this family, why doesn't this student value education? These are some of these comments and things that I hear across the board, and if I could write down every single one of these comments and talk about them, address them, I would. But in this case, we're going to talk about how we can address these as a policy component, as a policy piece, when we start to look at building cultural competency, not only for educators that are coming into our communities, but also for all of our administrative staff, but more importantly, on the other side of this, for our tribes to be heard, for our students to be heard, and for our families to be heard. That's what we want to start to do and build these relationships that cultural competence that comes with understanding what cultural competency is. So first thing we're going to do before we even take the dive into cultural competency is knowing what is culturally responsive education. A lot of us have heard this term before. Its synonym, which is culturally relevant education. And we've talked about it, and we try and integrate it, and people have thrown this word around. It's huge in the Native education realm, but do we really understand what that is? And so just to take a little bit of a dive here is looking at culturally responsive education is these things. And it's not limited to these things, so I don't want you to take this as this is it. But these are some very important components of it, especially when we start to talk about cultural competency. So the first one is pedagogy. Pedagogy is the art of teaching, that art of teaching that we have for each of us as educators, whether we're a teacher, whether we're an administrator, whether we're a native language teacher or a science teacher, whatever we do, we have a certain style of teaching. Each of us has our own way of teaching. And some of us from Native communities incorporate our cultural beliefs and the way that we would interact in our community into that pedagogy. And so looking at how culturally responsive education should be integrated, we also want to look at how pedagogy and how are we engaging our students, how are we teaching their students, and how are we learning alongside with our students? Because it shouldn't just be a one-way road. Teachers and students should be in a relative balance with each other. There should be reciprocity built in, especially when we're looking at learning on tribal lands and within a new community. We also look at teaching across cross-cultural and multicultural settings. And how do we begin to do that? Hold on. And then we look at how our methods of teaching and how are we relating to our students in a cultural context. Is what we are teaching, hold on, whoa. Sorry, guys. I don't know what just happened. I'm sorry. And that we're teaching and creating a connection to the learning that we're providing. We want it to be a learning environment that is conducive to something that their own experiences and how they relate to the world, how they relate to the content. And that is an important aspect of culturally responsive education, building an educational system and an environment that is inclusive of our students, their culture, their beliefs, their values, and their norms, and that they feel comfortable in this setting. That is a true hallmark of culturally responsive education. So as we look at culturally linguistically responsive education, there are some main components here. And depending on who you look, what research you look at, what camp you prescribe to, there's 6 main components that I utilize in my culturally responsive education pieces. And that's culturally appropriateness, cultural competency, cultural humility, cultural literacy, cultural relevancy, and cultural sustainability. We want to utilize those 6 components and create a balance within our classroom and our learning environments so that we can start to integrate all 6 of those components into the way that we teach and the way that we pull language. How do we utilize resources? And how do we start to, again, connect an educational experience for our students, that we can bring in native language into this mix, that we can understand the history and culture of a particular tribe, but more importantly, that particular tribe and the place that you're learning in a school may be tied to a specific community, and that community has its own history, has maybe its own dialect, maybe it has its own historical understandings that are hugely and vitally important to connecting to your families and your students. That goes into family engagement. How do we utilize all 6 of these to really start to engage our students and our families at a deeper level so that we're creating relationships, not just a student-teacher relationship, but deeper relationships that are going to cultivate deeper understandings so that not only the students are learning, but the teachers are learning alongside with them. Again, going back to that idea of reciprocity in this learning environment. And so I'm gonna talk about these 6 components briefly, but of course I'm gonna take a deeper dive into the cultural competency piece of this. So breaking this down. So when we look at being culturally appropriate, culturally appropriateness means that we can involve the following. We can look at all of these pieces that you see on the slide here: age, gender, ethnicity, and that we have an awareness of what is appropriate when we're talking about these things. We don't want to have age bias. We don't want to show gender bias. We don't want to show stereotypes for any of these groups that you see listed on here. But we want to think about how we have built-in bias and misconceptions maybe towards these things, and how can we start to build understanding so that we can start to be appropriate when we start to look at how we engage these, how we understand these, but also being very mindful that we bring our own cultural awareness, our background that we come from. And sometimes even us as Native Americans coming from a different tribe, a different community, a different location that may be completely different. Sometimes we tend to, hey, we're Native American, I understand these things, but it may be a little bit different. There may be some twists. So what is the appropriateness that we need to look at when we're looking at culturally responsive education, and how do we engage this at a deeper level? There's also this idea of cultural humility, and is the process of that self-reflection that I just talked about. And so looking at culturally appropriate, we need to also look at the cultural humility, because that's something that we need to, as educators, really be in a consistent and a constant place of looking at what are our blind spots. What are those things, that are understandings that we have that we may have misconceptions of, and start to understand those at a deeper level. So this is a continual process, but it's also learning about understandings that we may not know, but also again looking at stereotypes and biases. Cultural literacy is a huge component of culturally and linguistically responsive education. It's the ability to understand and interact and collaborate across different cultures. And a lot of times we think of literacy as reading and writing, but at a deeper level, it's the understanding of how to navigate and interact with cultural components, and engaging in the differences between language usage, cultural norms, values, and looking at how we start to construct our own understanding and develop those things so that we can look at how we can have a more inclusive, diverse, equitable, and collaborative classroom. The next part is the cultural relevancy. A lot of times we think about cultural relevancy as how do we connect things? How do we connect learning for our students? Is this relevant to what they're learning about? And a lot of times, even we can utilize an example such as history. There's something that would be very culturally relevant to a historical component here in New Mexico, might be a story about the Pueblo Revolt. Some of the other natives across the nation may not know what the Pueblo Revolt is and why that should be important to them. And maybe a more connected version of a historical story that may be relevant, similar to the Pueblo Revolt, might be in order. So when we look at cultural relevancy, we look at how all members of a group may not be the same. So again, like Native Americans may not all be the same, but what's relevant to a certain group, what's going to be the most beneficial tool, what's going to be the most beneficial resource that an educator could utilize to engage students and connect them to their learning. And so the last part before I dive into the competency piece is cultural sustainability. Is how do we make this sustainable? And culturally, how do we engage this at a level where that understanding starts to be scaffolded and built upon each other? We want to go beyond just being responsive and relevant. We also want to be able to sustain these pieces and understand them and build upon the lessons that they learn from a cultural standpoint, from a community-based standpoint, from an indigenous standpoint, and start to connect those educational experiences for our students. And so the last part is the cultural competency piece. And you see some of the definitions there, but on the next couple of slides, I'm gonna take again, a deeper dive into what those are. So, as I said before, there are a lot of different different definitions, different usages of this, and this is something throughout my research as a doctoral student and in the work that I do. This is a definition that I came up with that kind of encompasses a lot of the different disciplines that I've pulled cultural competency from. So in doing research, and especially doing the research for developing cultural competency frameworks for the BIE, one of the things that was most important is pulling from all these different places. So cultural competency isn't something that was born in education. There was a lot of other spaces that utilize cultural competency, such as social work, in the medical field. And you started to see this start to emerge in the educational realm. And so cultural competency, and I don't always read slides, but I'm going to read this one. Cultural competency is the intentional and ongoing engagement of providing a diverse, equitable, and inclusive learning environment which cultivates a shared understanding of the congruent attitudes, behaviors, policies, and broad understandings that impacts all levels and stakeholders of an educational learning environment. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but I have highlighted a couple of words in this definition that I want you to really take heed with. And so the first one is intentional. When we start to build culturally responsive education and we start to infuse it into our educational pieces, it's even more so important that we build cultural competency as an intentional piece. That is something we mindfully and willingly have collaborative process about building these into our educational systems. And why? Ongoing. We talked about sustainable in the last piece, that this isn't something that we do a training on, that we'd have a professional development on, that I give this particular presentation to you and it's done. This is an ongoing conversation because as we start to move forward in our educational careers, but also in our schools, things change. Things start to evolve as they go along. So one of the things that's really important, I mean, this may not necessarily be an example from a native standpoint, but when I was in school, as some of you guys were, maybe around my same age, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have the technology that we have here now. And so that cell phone and the things that teenagers can do on a cell phone right now are completely different. It's a completely different realm. So as they start to go forward, how do we utilize and how do we understand teenagers from a different perspective? Because that was different and that gives them a different perspective than somebody now. And so really starting to engage those things cultivates a shared understanding. So cultivating and growing these things, we are not expecting anybody to come into any educational environment and just know how to get in there. Some people that are better than others, and it's easier for others to start to understand, especially from a native to a native perspective. There may be some shared norms, values, beliefs that you might be able to, oh, okay, I understand. But from a non-native perspective, they may not be, it may be a little harder. So how do we cultivate that intentionally so that all of us are on the same page, that we're providing an atmosphere where we feel that our own experiences are validated and affirmed? And we'll talk about that in a second. And then at all levels and stakeholders. So cultural competency can't be just something that our teachers dive into. It can't be just something that the people in the classrooms dive into. This is something that needs to be understood at all levels of education, but also even outside of our our learning bubble, such as a school, by tribes, by our families, by our students. And how are we, again, intentionally creating these communication networks to be able to understand what this is and how it impacts educational learning communities. And so we want to look at culturally responsive education as equitable learning, but also in terms of cultural competency, these are some things that when we look at cultural competency, these are things that we are intentionally looking at from a community-based standpoint. So from a cultural competency standpoint, we're looking to and seeking to validate and affirm individual, family, community, and tribal identities. We want to try to understand who each of our students are, who each of those families are, each of those communities are, and each of the tribal identities. There's levels to this. And we want to try and, again, look at and challenge those misconceptions, those biases, those stereotypes, those things that we have as pieces of this learning a cultural competency so that we're understanding and meeting people where they're at, that we're being equitable in doing this. The next part is understanding of beliefs, knowledges, and values. As we enter into, just like I stated at the very opening, we all have different beliefs, knowledge, and value systems. Even within our own communities, there may be little differences between families and those beliefs and knowledge and values that we need to understand and take heed of as we move forward and we try to create a relationship building. We look at increased tribal collaboration and engagement. So building a cultural competency framework requires us to have tribal collaboration and engagement so that the tribes can tell us, these are some things that you need to know about us. These are some things that you need to understand about our culture. These are some things that you need to understand about our language. These are some things that we do not want you to talk about in regards to our students that may be quote unquote taboos. What are those things? And if we don't intentionally, again, have these collaborative engagements with tribes, with stakeholders, with local communities, then we run the risk of hurting somebody. And it may not necessarily be hurting them physically, but this is where you start to build tension because those understandings are not being established. The last part is responsive and sustainable administrative and educational understandings. Really trying to build understanding throughout our administration, our teachers, our faculty, our staff, everybody across the educational network knowing and being involved and engaged in this process. And again, that it is an ongoing process. At the end of the day, what we really want to move toward is this idea of equity and fidelity. Equity from the standpoint is that we want to understand and make sure that we're understanding people from where they're standing from, where they're coming from. The fidelity, going back to what is the community, what is the tribe, what is the parents, what does the student need? How can we have fidelity back to where they're at in their equitable needs? And so culturally responsive education, and more importantly, the competency, needs these best practice considerations to be very successful. And these are just three, and we can go on, but these are the main three that I see as huge components of building cultural competency frameworks and a starting point for building cultural competency frameworks. So the first one is historical understanding. Like I said in an earlier slide, communities have their own unique stories. Tribes have their own unique stories. Parents, families have their own unique stories. And these are some things that until you start to build understanding and a relationship with each of these different components and each of these different entities and each of the different people that you're going to be working with, it's hard to start to build an understanding and be able to teach to their understandings and connect things for them. This is, again, a reciprocal process. And history can be and often is a root cause of trauma and social emotional issues. So we want to be mindful of how we start to engage and we interact with the historical understandings that we have, and not place our own historical understandings of it, but learn from the community's unique perspective of how they view history from their standpoint. And especially in the case of education may have been a very forceful and traumatic experience for generations. And so understanding that and how that might directly, indirectly affect students in the classroom today is an important aspect of cultural competency. The second one is geographic considerations. So in cultural competency, geographic considerations are huge because we might have a community that's situated on a border right next to a large city. And the community resources may be different. The interaction with that community may be different versus a rural community, where geographic considerations, you might have to have cultural competency to be able to navigate, how do I get water? How do I get Wi-Fi access? How do I get food? How does that affect socioeconomic statuses? How does that affect opportunities and resources? How does it overall, this geographic location, how does it influence the people and the families, and more importantly, the students in your classrooms, in your schools? And so the last one is looking at demographic considerations and identifying who are the people in your schools, in your communities. What are some pieces that are at play? There are some schools where you have multiple tribes and multiple tribes represented in that school. There may be some schools where there's nothing but one, there may be just one, a vast majority of the students are from one tribe, and maybe there might be one that's not, and how does that one student get affected by that? And so as you start to look at demographic considerations, not just native, it's also our special needs, the individual needs of each of our students. Do they have learning disabilities? What are some of the things that you need to know about your community and schools and the demographics that are there and the interplay of those demographics at your school, and how does that affect your understanding of that particular school and that particular learning environment? Excuse me. So why each school needs its own cultural competency framework? And that's really simple. And it comes down to that each community is different. Every single one of the communities that I enter in, they may be a couple of miles apart, they're different. And how people have pride in where they come from. The way that they talk may be different. There's huge differences in just each community. Each community is connected to, in most of our communities that we come from, especially in Native country, each community is connected to a unique tribe. Each tribe has its own unique culture, governance, and language. Each tribe is situated in its own locality, region, and state. Each of those communities is connected to a school with its own unique dynamic faculty and staff. Every single person in that school is different from place to place. And the interplay there and the dynamic is different. Community has its own unique set of cultural beliefs, norms, and values. Each community has its own unique community-based resources. So for all of these reasons that I've stated here, when we start to build cultural competency frameworks and ultimately cultural competency policies, we do so with these understandings put into place, because we can't take a cultural competency framework from Navajo and place it and expect that to work in Lakota, because each of those communities in Lakota country, let's just say Cheyenne River, we can't do that because they're two completely different communities. There may be some crossovers, but that doesn't mean that they're the same community. But also, again, with the specificity, like we stated at the beginning, when you're going to a certain place, if you're going into somebody's house, if you're going into somebody, or if you're friends with somebody and you're building a relationship, you build that relationship based on that individual need. And it's the same with this cultural competency framework and the cultural competency policies that we would like to be able to see built, so that each of our schools and the people that are coming into it, there's an understanding going both ways, that the tribe and the community are providing information that is vital to understanding the community and the tribe ahead of time, but also that on the other side of this, that a teacher is able to start to understand and integrate those understandings into how they might better provide connection, support to our students and our families within those communities. And so the last part of this is looking at the exploration of educator identity and pedagogy, which are two fundamental components of looking at cultural competency. So when you look at cultural competency, we talked about earlier about stereotypes, biases, and misconceptions. Every educator, when we look at educators, a lot of times educators, And I mean, and up until recently, a lot of our educators have not been versed in culturally and linguistically responsive education. That's just not a part of a lot of educator pipelines right now. I mean, it's currently being put in. I think even more so now with the social justice climate, you start to see that shift. But a lot of times when we look at educator identity, a lot of times teachers don't understand what that is, and that we all have an educator identity and a pedagogy. We talked about pedagogy earlier. And as an educator, we all have these experiences. We all have these things that have happened to us through the course of our lives that shape who we are, not only as an educator, but as a person. Some of us have come from hard backgrounds. Some of us have come from very wealthy backgrounds. Some of us have come from cultural backgrounds. Some of us don't know our languages. Some of us, there's different experiences. And we're all coming to the table with these different experiences, but they all culminate in what we do as educators. And a lot of times we don't think about this, but they are exemplified through the way that we teach in our personalities. Each of us are different. And that goes back to our pedagogy, the art of teaching. What are some things that we do individually as educators that lend themselves to how we teach? And sometimes we find ways that are very beneficial, and some it may be beneficial to teach a certain way in a certain community with a certain demographic, which may not transfer over to another community or demographic. So we want to look at these educator identities and pedagogies, and when entering communities, what do we need to know not only about our community, but about ourselves? What is it that we need to shift? Because all of us have that, like we talked about earlier with building relationships, not all friends are the same. We may have 10 best friends, and all of them may not be the same. They all have their own needs and wants. Just like our communities, our students, our families, our tribes are going to all have their own individual needs and wants. And how do we build a relationship that's going to take our best pieces and what we understand and our learning and start to connect those pieces? And again, the pedagogy needs to be re-examined to account for these differences in that delivery and engagement. But the last part of this, and I want to hammer this part home, is that administrators and educators cannot merely transpose their previous experience and methods to other communities. You may have a bang up lesson plan that worked so well for 25 years in one community, and you try and go and you put it into another one, it may bomb on you because it may not have the same depth, breadth, connection as it did before. So these are some things as we look at cultural competency, why it's important that it's an intentional piece in looking at building culturally responsive education for our students. So I just want to say lastly that this is a lot of foundational understanding needs to be had with culturally and linguistically responsive education, but also there's some very intentional pieces that are here. And so I just want to open it up for questions from everybody. And if you have questions, if you have comments, it would be great to hear those. And if there's any clarifications I can make, I'd also be able to do that also. But I just want to say thank you before anything else for joining today. And it's good to see some familiar faces and names on the screen also. That's awesome. Hi, Cree.
I like to say something.
Yes, sir.
So you were talking about like cultural components within the educate educators, and I worked at the school, but I didn't have the a degree, but I stayed within the school because I have the cultural and language uh, for our area,
Mm-hmm.
and being cultural sensitive to a lot of things like you were talking about. There was taboos and what we do, and sometimes people go outside that scope, they try to push, and I think part of it is both the educator and the student, um, to kind of push the taboos a little bit, what we do and how we do those things. And but I think because we try to educate both sides, the students and the teacher, to say,
Mm-hmm.
well, we don't do that because that's traditional. If we
Mm-hmm.
follow our culture, that tradition says that no, we can't do that yet. Only in a certain time of the year that we follow that. But that and I don't know how to say it. Like if it's insensitive or, to me it's very sensitive because we have to follow that way of, because if you teach them the wrong way from the beginning at a young age, then they'll know no better.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of that cultural part is that the importance of doing the right thing from the very beginning, and like you said, have that consistency.
And I completely agree with you, Richard. Thank you for that, because I think one of the things that is also important is that it's in building the reciprocity between not only the school and the community, you also start to reinforce those. And I think that's where building those cultural understandings, those value system, belief systems at a very early age, and really start to engage in these at a family level, and reinforcing those at home, just like with language, with native languages, is so important and vital. But also the disconnection, like I was stating, and I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole, but when you look at historical trauma from boarding school era, from our disconnection from native experiences with education, 50, 60, 70 years ago, how those directly and indirectly affect us now. There's disconnections that have happened for natives, especially when you look at education systems. And so those education systems have been, and the understandings that we have been highly westernized. And so really looking at reinforcing the way that we look at our value systems and how, what those understandings are, because of course that may look different from community to community. I know that there's a lot of our students in our community, in my community that I come from, for example, that are very culturally versed, that know that you're not supposed to talk about certain animals or do certain things during certain times of the year. But in other places that cultural understanding may have started to erode a little bit, and that needs some revitalization also. So I think therein lies some pieces where really looking from at a tribal standpoint, what do we need to engage in here when we look at cultural competency? And then that's why it's so important to intentionally have these conversations and not wait for somebody to do it, but hey, what do we need to know about your tribe or your community, or vice versa? What do we need to know about your school and the people there that are going to be able to create this again, this idea of reciprocity that you have between the two? And I have a question in here, and somebody asked, could you speak to the importance of not only having this competency and responsiveness at the teaching level, but also in school administration? And that's something that is, and believe me, I've given a bunch of different professional developments all across the country with different tribes. And the thing is that always irks me, and even within my own, even in my own entity within the Bureau of Indian Education, is that a lot of times when I give professional development on culturally and linguistically responsive education and these components, a lot of times it's the teachers that are there or the teachers support staff. I can probably count on my hands how many times I saw administrators actually engaging in these types of learning spaces and places when we're talking about culturally and linguistically responsive education. And that's harmful in the sense that I can have a bunch of different teachers doing some really great and awesome work in culturally and linguistically, really creating these equitable learning environments and engaging culture and connecting education for their kids, bringing in a bunch of cultural resources. But when you have an administrator that has no idea what that is, and their idea of education may be towards, well, we need to grow our English proficiencies, or we need to grow some of these other proficiencies. You start to see these things come to a head, and maybe don't see the support that they should be getting to see the connectedness that is being built for our students in these realms. And so it's very vital that are not only just the teaching staff and the people in the classrooms understand this, but more importantly, the administrators, because as I talked about in the presentation, you talk about sustainability. The teachers can create sustainability for their own classrooms and their own understandings, but the administrators are very key in looking at budgetary considerations, looking at strategic directions, looking at engaging school board in some of these things, and how this becomes a part of an environment and a policy that is kind of filtering into all aspects of the learning environment, not just that one particular classroom. I hope I answered your question. I can't see where I put that. But any other questions from anybody, or comments even? I welcome anything from you guys.
Hi. Sometimes
Hello.
I get frustrated that I just can't go to the bookstore and buy a couple of books that are bilingual. And I know I'm not the only one that feels that way, but like I have friends who, because their language is not, it wasn't originally written, like there wouldn't have been books when they were a child, and they're grown-ups now. And knowing that, where do you find the balance between wanting to meet someone where they're at, or a tribe where they're at, yet wanting to encourage your friends in their language? Because I mean, other than just going and buying a few textbooks and trying in my own lame way to interpret them and you know, write in them, because I used to do that with languages like French and stuff, but they have books, you know, those books aren't needed. Languages in with native languages, books with native languages are needed. And even though it wasn't a like something that was, I don't know how to say that, something that was available, books were not available because it wasn't a written language, but meeting the grown-ups who want to learn the language where they're at right now. So basically, like, grown-ups, like, how do you meet that without stepping on toes? Or, I mean, do you just do a little group together and make your own type of resources? Or, you know, it's a strange middle ground.
And that's a tough conversation to have, because I think and I hope I'm going to answer this correctly for you, and at least give you at least some. So when we start to look at native languages, there's, again, and this is, I said this in my previous conversations. So I was talking about native language growth and EL programs in that regard. A lot of times, even for my BIE schools and a lot of other schools that I visited, they'll start native language programs with a couple of people that know the language, which is great. I'm glad that they're doing it. However, the thing is that the language isn't just isn't the property of just 2 or 3 people. It belongs to a group of people, in this case a tribe. And how do they want to exemplify this language? How do they want to engage this language in a learning environment, but maybe even outside of that? And so that's very different, can vary from tribe to tribe. So there's tribes that have looked at this, like, let's just say Navajo. Navajo's been is an academic language now because it's taught in universities. Non-natives can learn Navajo, but there's other tribes who have decided we don't want other people to learn our language. There's certain there's appropriation that goes along with that, and it's a very fine line between trying to figure out what people want, and that's something that, again, engaging tribes in these conversations and people from that is part of this process. And it may not just be like for you, I know that you're talking about maybe having some integration and talking with some of your friends, people you know, but on a larger scale, what does that look like? And that may not be a conversation that you may want to, I don't know if you're from a tribe or if you're an outsider to the particular community you're in, but it would be, that's something where it's a very kind of gray area where you start to get into, and especially trying to figure out how and why they would want to do things in a certain way, because again, it goes back to those historical considerations. Maybe even for my language, for my tribe, we don't have a written language, it's all oral, everything. And the tribe does not want to go to to a written language, but there's historical components that go along with that that are very traumatic in nature. So to have that conversation, it takes some very kind of treading some kind of walking that little tightrope, but also maybe how do you create the conversation? And maybe that's more the important way to go. It's just maybe talking about how do you engage the conversation, and how can I help? And sometimes people don't want help, and you have to respectfully say, okay, I'm throwing my hands up. But I hope I answered your question. Like I said, it is a gray area, and it's kind of a hard question to answer, but it again goes back to those individual tribes, families, communities, what have you.
Thank you. Yes, it did. I think this is an important discussion. Like, this is more important than, you know, a language. I think it's very important. So I think that's worth finding out.
Yeah. And somebody had put a question in the, Lori asked, is there any type of federal mandate in regard to cultural competency in Indian education? And so, and there's a couple of spaces and places within the federal codes and regulations for Bureau of Indian Education that talk about culturally responsive education. And there's other pieces in there that talk about holistic learning. There's places where it talks about multicultural and multilingual, bilingual education. But there's nothing in there specifically that talks about cultural competency. So when I utilize, especially for me, I try and pull to justify the work. A lot of the things that I do, I pull from those pieces and interpret it in a way that it's okay. If I'm going to if it says to do culturally responsive education, and we're doing from a holistic standpoint and looking at the spiritual wellness of an entire community and tribe, then cultural competency is a part of that. And if we don't understand cultural competency, then how are we engaging or understanding the wellness and holistic wellness of a particular community in regards to culture and language? So again, there's nothing there that specifically outlines and says cultural competency, but I guess if you read between the lines, and of course everything's open for interpretation in that, in the federal code, you can look for different pieces, but in BIE, there is not any one particular space or place that it states that we need to mandate cultural competency. Anybody else?
I have a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
So going back to Laurel, I'm Navajo Dene, and I work at a border town, Residential Hall, Winslow. And so I have a lot of Hopi and Navajo students. And I've been with the program for about 9.5 years now. And in the beginning, I was kind of more wanting to be open to a lot of our Hopi students and their language. So I was kind of doing some research, looking up articles, anything I could find as far as language. And I wanted to purchase a couple of Hopi dictionaries, and they're very expensive. I think it was like over $500 just for one book. So something we couldn't really, manage to purchase due to our grant conditions. The amount was just too high. So as I kind of got to know the Hopi students more. They are the ones who are teaching me. So, I'm learning a lot from them. And what they told me was that in those Hopi dictionaries, there's some words that aren't supposed to be in there. They're very sacred. So going back to, teaching more orally, rather than written. So I had to, respect that, that there are some sacred words, I'm sure, that are only meant for a certain time of the season, or they're meant for a certain ceremony. So, I really got that. And then, so just going along, every year, I've tried to learn more words from them, as well as learn more of the Diné language. But what I found out was really helpful is more hands-on projects. We started a cornfield. The students plant and harvest on their own. So going through that, I was able to get words from them in Hopi on the colors of corn, squash, beans, the actual words for the items and also the growth process. So I think it really helps having more of a hands-on, I guess, utilizing your native way of life to incorporate those words as well. So, that's just a little bit of information that, I have as far as, learning more other languages as within our tribal nations. And then I also had a question for you. What programs are in the Southwest that are following your cultural competence? Sorry, I can't even say it. But anyways, how many are following your program? Because it's very interesting. This is the first time I'm hearing about it. And it is very interesting, and it's really bringing up a lot of good key points that is very important. So I just want to know if there were any programs already following.
Okay. Well, first, I just wanted to just really quickly just comment on what you said with your school. I think one of the things that I've looked at, because I do a lot of work with off-reservation boarding schools that have 76, 86 different tribes that are infused in one location. And I think one of the things it's really powerful to look at also is to build cross-cultural understandings and cross-cultural competencies within those groups, because a lot of times, even historically, like Hopi and Navajo, there was places where they were kind of feuding with each other, but there was also places where there was commonalities. And so where do you start to build those understandings and cultivate some of those understandings? Because you want to build diversity and understanding, not look at the differences and sit there. And I mean, you can look at differences, those are important, but I think it's also an important piece to look at building those understandings cross-culturally for those students. I was just going to say that part. I mean, even beyond going, just because language is a huge component. I mean, that's a huge dive for anybody to go into. But I think also looking at maybe some of those places where there may be some stereotypes and bias and misconceptions that they have for each other that might be beneficial to building a more collaborative kind of intertribal understanding for each other. I just wanted to just offer that. But I think the other part is there's some immersion schools that have taken on some of these culturally and linguistically responsive pieces, like I mentioned the 6 pieces, but that have taken those and really integrated those into, and they build their school around those things. And that's what they're utilizing. And some of those, like I'm thinking about some immersion programs, like there's one, Enemy Swim, that's a tribally controlled school up in South Dakota. There's one here in New Mexico, the Karis Learning Center. Native American Community Academy here in Albuquerque has some pieces that do that. But there's not and I think there's other schools have incorporated pieces of culturally and linguistically responsive education, but it hasn't necessarily been this holistic entire school-wide thing. And so that goes back to like the question with administrators that was asked earlier, and even staff. Who all knows about this? Who's all engaging in this? What's the intentionality of all of this? And are we moving towards this together, or is it just one teacher or one administrator or one school? In here in New Mexico, they have these things that they implemented called equity boards at each of these schools and school districts. And I'm on board with some of those. And there's some schools and like here in the place where I'm at outside of Albuquerque in Rio Rancho Public Schools, it's a school system with 32 schools, but one school is implementing culturally linguistically responsive education as a policy. So it's kind of here, and I mean, it's kind of all over the map when you start to look at that. But I'm hoping that as we start to build foundational pieces, and even more so, teacher pipelines are starting to engage this more intentionally. We start to have more of this built into our school systems, especially within our Native communities. But I think I'm out of time. But I just want to say thank you guys again for tuning in. And if there's any questions, I know that we're going to share these. Somebody asked about sharing these PowerPoints out, and I think ANA will be sending these presentations out in some way, shape, fashion, or form. I'm not quite sure how they're going to do that and what platform. I know they're going to make the video shareable also. So and I'm not quite sure how they're going to do that either. But I just want to say thank you so much for everything, and hope you guys have a good rest of your school year virtually and whatever communities you're working in. I just stay safe. Thank you.